Hey folks, welcome back. It's been a while since we talked about Traveller, so I thought I'd show off one of my more recent purchases for the system. This is the Imperial Navy, a source book for Mongoose Traveller 2nd edition. It's a lot of fluff rather than mechanics, if you like, but that actually makes it more useful in a way for game masters. Even players would get a lot out of this, I think, if you wanted to play a character with a Navy background. This is assuming, of course, that you use the official Traveller universe, so-called charted space. If you're using your own setting, you can at least mine this for ideas on how interstellar warfare might work and how star navies might be organized, and in that respect it's still useful. But I've really enjoyed this book. It's a relatively quick read. It's just under 200 pages, but there's a hell of a lot packed in here, so we'll take a look. And I'll show you, besides the cool cover, why you should grab a hold of this. Without its senior service, the Third Imperium would not exist. The Navy is entwined in the politics and economics of the Imperium, a training ground for the great nobility, and a route to social advancement for the general populace. The Imperial Navy details this massive force from the great fleets down to a band of new recruits. And they talk about some of the questions that are answered here. There we go. So we'll crack in. We've just got the black void of space here for the end papers. Nothing particularly special there. As usual, fairly sparse table of contents, but it gives you what you need to know for this volume. The author here is Martin Doherty, who any Traveller fan knows is a frequent author for the Traveller system. Produces a lot of high quality stuff. So we get an introduction to the Imperial Navy, a bit of historical perspective on it, the role of it within the Imperium, methods of fighting an interstellar war, which I find it particularly interesting given the time delays that the jump drive introduces into interstellar warfare. Then we have the organization of the Navy, commanding fleets, how naval bases work, ships and craft, naval operation, shipboard operation, ship handling, tactics, which is another interesting chapter if you're looking at getting into some of the Fifth Frontier War stuff. That'll be particularly relevant. Equipment and weaponry, personnel, naval procedures. There's some details on the Old Expanse sector fleet and the So-Skirre subsector fleet. And then there's a big chapter about life aboard the Tigris class dreadnought, which is very cool actually. I mean, the Tigris class is absolutely enormous with thousands of crew, and the way they break it down and kind of get into the details of that is really interesting. You'll see there's some lovely artwork here to open it up. We've got a very propaganda-ish poster. Looks like a Tigris there in the background. We got some cruisers flying about as well. We have a Vargar here looking fierce, a saluting soldier in a vacuum suit, and what looks to be an officer with his saber. Semi-ceremonial weapon, but also useful in a boarding action. So the intro walks you through Imperial Navy on a broad level, what's it supposed to do, what's its role within the Third Imperium, and how it keeps the Imperium together across the vast expanses of systems that it covers. And they give you the peacetime fleet structure, so you have different levels of fleets. You've got the domain fleet, and it's commanded by the Grand Admiral. Then you have the sector fleets, commanded by a sector admiral. And then we have the subsector fleets, commanded by a fleet admiral, or also known as a subsector admiral. And then down to system flotillas and squadrons, run by fleet admirals or commodores. And so we get this hierarchical structure where we have the overarching navy is broken down into sectors, subsectors, and then systems. They talk a little bit about the way that this doctrine facilitates the use of the Imperial Navy in conflicts and the use of reserve fleets and stuff like that. Then we get a little bit of historical perspective. So how did the Imperial fleet evolve into the form we know it today? Go all the way back to the Pax Villani and the Grand Empire of Stars, then the rise of the Soleimani, fall of the rule of man, and the so-called Long Night before the rise of the Third Imperium. So that's when, space was sort of broken apart, travel was infrequent, and there wasn't a sort of unifying structure to a lot of the inhabited systems. And then the Third Imperium rose, and we had the pacification campaigns from the year 76 to 120. So the Imperium was sort of rapidly absorbing a number of small states and single worlds. There was some still rebellious ones amongst them, so a lot of pacification, as they called it, had to be done. Then there was the Julian Wars and the Aslan and Vargar Wars, and these were in the Vargar Quarter campaigns and intermittent conflicts with Aslan clans in Reaver's Deep, which you'll find more details on in one of the recent sector books as well. And there's a new Aslan source book coming out soon in physical form. It's already out in PDF. Then we got the early Frontier Wars, the Civil War in the Third Imperium, then the Soleimani Rim War, the Fourth Frontier War, and of course now we're into the Fifth Frontier War. And then we talk about what's the role of the Navy. And the most basic element is to be present. So it's not just about existing, but they have to fly the flag and remind anybody who might rise up against the Imperium that criminals, aggressors, pirates, etc. will be captured and punished, and that the Imperium maintains power. So that people see that they're active, they're maintaining control. Also for law enforcement and internal security. So they make sure that if there are corridors of travel where piracy is frequent, they'll send somebody in, enforce the law, take them down. So piracy suppression is part of it, but also maintaining confidence amongst the sort of commercial spacers is pretty essential to the economy. So you need to make sure that trade is kept safe. There's also diplomacy and soft power protection. So the presence or perceived presence of the Navy is vital to imperial diplomacy, as it says here. So sometimes it just takes sending a few big old ships to a system to get them to understand exactly the level of power that they're dealing with. Soft power projection, as they call it, is where, warship might be deployed to a system where piracy is becoming a problem, and just the presence of that warship just shows that whoever is asking for assistance from the Navy in this problem is being listened to. And at times, the Navy can be a direct tool of diplomacy. So if somebody negotiating with the Imperium is not willing to cooperate, the Imperium might send a massive battleship that could take out an entire enemy fleet and say, well, what are you going to do now? Back off or deal with the consequences. They also, of course, as we mentioned, protect commerce, but also other interests. An Imperial outpost being under guarded or under attack from enemy forces, they can be sent out to protect that. They can intervene and keep the peace. So if there are neighboring states with problems, then the Imperial Navy might reach out to project power and keep the peace in a region where war is threatened. So just the sight, again, of a grand Imperial battleship often calms things down. And of course, last of all, and hopefully least frequent, is the fighting of actual wars. And that's where we get into the next chapter, which is really interesting. Difficult things about interstellar warfare in the Traveller setting is that you have obstacles in your way. Firstly, because of jump drive delay, it always takes about a week once the ship enters jump for them to get to whatever the destination is. And it's very difficult to tell what the destination actually will be. You have to send scouts ahead, and it'll be a minimum of 2 weeks before your scouts come back with info on the position of the enemy fleet, at which time they may have jumped away. So it's all a matter of moves and counter moves and having a strategic sense of where you need to shore up your defenses, where you might be able to probe the enemy's weaknesses. And also, the Imperium's fighting forces have set out a couple of basic principles out of all their centuries of experience. So first is you want to avoid losing. If you're about to lose a frontier system, it would leave some important vessels exposed, then just abandon the system and fall back, keep your assets, and shore up the next line of defense, that kind of thing. Secondly, you should concentrate your forces, and that's a typical military doctrine that we see in the real world as well. You typically want to have as much of an advantage as you can in terms of force projection over your opponent as you can in a given battle. So the Navy, of course, follows that. They'll try to concentrate their forces, sweep through a system at a time, make certain that there will be a victory in front of them in each of those steps. They also want to conduct reconnaissance and maintain comms. So this is a matter of using your scouts and your faster ships with higher level jump drives. So they can jump ahead, they can disseminate information to local populations to prepare defenses. They can find out if enemy forces are present or where they might be. You have to make sure that you maintain communications with your scouts, because one of the things about the Traveller universe is that the speed of ship travel is as fast as communication goes. So unless you send a ship out somewhere, they're not going to get any comms from you. So you need to send people out and make sure that comms are maintained, and that whoever is in the line of fire, if you like, during a conflict is got orders and knows what to do, because it'll be at least a week before you can jump there. Then you got to strike at a decisive point. So you need to think about what are the key systems that will sort of let the dominoes start falling. Where are the largest installations, where are the vulnerable installations, and then attack those in force, and that will allow you to establish a beachhead and expand out from there. Finally, you want to create conditions of victory. Basically, you want to create a positive outcome. It doesn't have to be out and out victory. It could just be a propaganda victory. So there are ways to create the right sort of psychological and physical and logistical conditions for a positive outcome, even if you're in a difficult situation in reality within the war. And then talk about some of the realities here. So, how to deal with these multiple week delays where you're waiting for your scouts to come back, what that means for logistics and communications. So, logistics being maintaining your forces and their supplies. So make sure you have new fighters coming to your carriers, and make sure you have enough fuel for all your massive ships with huge fuel tanks. So you need to have a sort of cycle they've developed. Concentrate your forces together, coordinate in one place, then dissipate, go to accomplish your various local missions, and then reconcentrate somewhere established at the end. Again, it's moves and counter moves. You got to look ahead. You got to think strategically. The practice of naval engagements, neutralizing and defeating enemy naval forces. One way to neutralize an enemy navy is to just have them be in the wrong place. Make a feint, if you like. Or you can attack their lines of supply, their bases, make them suffer from shortage of fuel and ammunition or fighters. And that can really take a whole fighting force out of commission. If they don't have a way to maintain their presence and keep moving forward, then they'll be stuck waiting for supplies to come, and you can move on with your plans. Logistics, as with any war and supply, is a huge part of victory, but particularly in the Traveller setting, where you have this jump delay to deal with, and you have enormous demands from these big ships for fuel and supply. Having control over empty space is useless. You need to have control over actual stuff. Systems, planets, bases need to be under your control, and so space battles are fought for something. They're not just, random encounters in the middle of the void. You'd be fighting only when you need to defend something that's worth defending, because every individual ship costs trillions of credits, right? These big battleships. So not worth wasting them to fight over nothing. Then we talk about the organization of the Imperial Navy, so procurement, disposal of ships, the regular Navy, so these are the assets that belong to the Imperium directly, and they're maintained in a high state of readiness, but the level of competence for that readiness varies from region to region because, again, necessarily we have this hierarchical structure. The Imperial Core Fleet, they are closest to the Emperor. Center of operations is basically wherever the Emperor happens to be at the time. However, they don't have a lot of combat experience. Members of the Core Fleet are rotated out and temporarily assigned elsewhere in a sort of never-ending rotation, and that way part of the Imperial Fleet is always out there gaining some experience in actual operations. And then we got the Colonial Fleet, which apparently is a misnomer. It's a shadow organization that parallels the regular Navy. It contains vessels available to Imperial Admirals but are not owned by the regular Navy, so a better name would be like an auxiliary fleet. These are primarily ships that are sourced from member worlds, and they loan them to the Imperial Navy, and they support local subsector fleets and provide escort vessels, patrol vessels, that kind of thing. Then we have the Reserve Fleet. That's a second shadow organization, which is directly run by the Imperial Navy this time. So these vessels are usually inactive. There are different categories of reserve. So contracted reservist means they're currently in service and ready for assignment. Ready reserve means they're fully functional but just need a full crew. Then you have Category 1 down to Category X. Category X means good as a source of spares. And Category 6 means you need almost a year to get the ships ready for battle. So multiple layers of reserve status. And the longer war goes on, you've got kind of a deep bench that the Imperium can dive into to get more ships on the front lines, which is pretty smart. And they talk about local defense forces and the role of the Army and Marine Corps. So the Navy will provide transport and information transfer to Army units. The Army itself doesn't have starships. Basically, the Army and Navy are completely separated out. So anything that can leave orbit is belonging to the Navy or the Marines. Navy transports will bring sort of Navy assault ships that can land the troops, but the Navy is in charge of navigating between worlds, and the Army is responsible for taking and holding the surfaces of worlds themselves. And then you got the Marine Corps. So they have starships of its own, typically rely on naval transports, but they also have assault vessels and support ships and marine fighter carriers, and they can deploy in atmosphere and descend into atmosphere as well as fighting in space. So they're pretty flexible in that regard. And Marines also serve aboard Navy vessels and protect naval installations. So a lot of Navy vessels will have squadrons of Marines aboard them in small detachments, and they're also typically trained in naval gunnery procedures, so they can be part of a warship crew in a productive way, not just hanging about waiting for a surface battle to need taking on. So political direction of the Navy is typically exercised by the nobility, but the command is reserved for the admirals. No noble has the right to give direct orders to naval personnel. Then you have the imperial-wide political direction of the whole fleet that comes from the emperor, and within the domains, they're run by the archdukes in a political sense. And then we have the sector level, though they're run by sector dukes, and then a sector fleet will have one numbered subsector fleet per subsector, so that'll be 16 for a full sector that's under imperial control. And then subsectors, which usually have a cruiser as its flagship plus a bunch of destroyers. And then at system level, there won't be that many system level deployments except for naval bases and the capital itself. And then there are flotillas, squadrons, and task forces. So these are temporary formations that are built around a singular mission. So for example, to provide escort for a diplomat or to take out pirate vessels or something like that. These are put together kind of on an as needed basis. So squadrons of smaller ships are typically led by the more senior captain of the squadron, and then you'll have the term flotilla being used. That's for a system defense force that has craft of different sizes and capabilities, a mishmash of stuff basically, but they'll be deployed to secure an area of several star systems. And then we have different kinds of fleets. So any large enough grouping of warships could be called a fleet technically, but there are different types of fleets. The way they're constructed is to follow different mission profiles. So you have the battle fleets. They're typically constructed around battleships and dreadnoughts and any supporting forces forces that help them stay safe in the battle. They're intended to engage the enemy directly and break them down. You got the strike fleet, so they're similar to the battle fleets, but they're optimized for speed and firepower. They're designed to advance quickly, deliver crippling damage, and then take off. And they're sometimes used to clear a path for an assault or battle fleet. We got the penetration fleets, so they're designed to punch deep into enemy territory and screw things up as much as possible for them before retreating or receiving assistance from a battle fleet that's pulling up behind them. You got the assault fleets then, so they are for bringing surface forces to a world and using orbital bombardment and fire support from space. Got the interdiction fleets. These are pretty rare, but it's sometimes necessary to stop a major opposing force moving through a system. So they will try to stop all traffic accessing and leaving a particular world, and even carrying out bombardment if necessary, and they'll try to sort of blockade a system. The composition of these fleets can vary a lot. Then we've got reinforcement fleets, so they're temporary fleets of mixed squadron types, and they're basically created from squadrons sort of joining up to join an ongoing conflict. Glory Fleet is an extant force that's won the accolade for meritorious service, and that's an award conferred by the Emperor. So the other Glory Fleets are temporary formations that won the accolade from the Emperor, but were to be disbanded before it expired, and rather than having the identity of this Glory Fleet lapse when the fleet stands down, it becomes sort of a home for honored vessels that are no longer in Navy service. And then they talk about handling fleets, how they're deployed, and how they're used in a major war. And then we get into the conduct of war itself. So this is where things get really difficult. The success of a campaign is often predetermined by decisions made years before, and that's kind of a consequence of the way the Navy is organized. It has a lot of capability to move and to rebuild squadrons or fleets in different ways as the conflict goes on, but if you position your fleets poorly or your bases poorly, then that could lead to serious problems even if you're well prepared for the conflict. Selected systems are typically assigned a subsidy to pay for powerful in-system forces, and they become kind of fortress worlds, and they will sort of be the front line in case of any major conflict that breaks out. And then the sector admiral, as soon as the conflict arrives, will become the theater commander, and they usually stay at the main base and sort of remain in charge throughout that conflict. And meanwhile, the subsector commanders will gather intelligence and undertake whatever harassment they can against the enemy forces. And in the event of a major war, some of those subsector admirals may be moved to command part of the sector fleet. There are ways that command can be reorganized in the context of a major conflict. They talk some more here about reinforcements and how heavy forces are assigned, where forces are transferred given the situation, and the cases where a Grand Admiral might be sent to take over a war zone if multiple sectors are involved in a conflict. And then we have a chapter on commanding the fleets. Here we have more details about the commanders and admirals who run all these collections of warships, and they make an interesting note here that despite portrayals in fiction and popular vid shows, the Navy does not make someone an admiral as a reward for heroics. Admirals are strategists and administrators, and without correct preparation, all someone can do is barge through and hope things work out. So an admiral is somebody who has decades of experience honed by training, and they combine their abilities in politics with their abilities in strategy. So they balance the demands of the nobility against the realities of what's actually happening in the war zone. This is a very specific set of skills that a random captain of a great warship won't necessarily have. So the Emperor is the Admiral-in-Chief and assisted by the Admiralty Board, so they're the heads of various divisions within the Navy and the overall commander. And in practice, the Navy is commanded by the Admiral of the Fleet, which is the highest naval rank. Then you have your Grand Admirals, then your Sector Admirals and Staff Admirals. Fleet Admirals, there are 3 grades of them: Fleet Admiral, Vice Admiral, and Rear Admiral. And then we have Commodores and Staff Officers. The Commodore is kind of the leader of a squadron of vessels. And then we have the different types of squadrons and flotillas. So the Batron is the battle squadron. So typically dreadnoughts and battleships surrounded by couriers, escorts, and tankers, and maybe some cruisers. We have the Creurons. So these are typically intended to support Batrons. They're supported by fighter carriers, tankers, transports, and fleet couriers. Then we have Assaultrons. So they're equipped for troop transportation and supply. So they've got transports, tankers, fleet couriers, and a screen of escort vessels. And then they basically will use that to mount an invasion. We've got Desrons. These are destroyer squadrons. They normally have a group of several destroyers. Sometimes they will have numerous destroyers with differing capabilities. So the destroyer force might consist of, say, 3 small squadrons of 2 to 3 vessels, and that would be sort of a flotilla, but still a Desron in function. We've got tanker squadrons, tankerons. These are specialist units that are designed to help the mobility of the Imperial fleets. So you've got fuel tankers, cruiser as a flagship, and a group of escort vessels, transports, couriers, similar vessels that are all there for support and logistics, basically. Then we got your scoutrons, your scout squadrons. So these are ships that are on secondment to the Navy from the Imperial Interstellar Scout Service, and they have a wide variety of vessels. They are mainly used as a holding unit for scout assets assets, and they're detached and assigned wherever they're needed. So when intelligence is required for a crew run or a batron or a subsector fleet or whatever, then they can attach a scout run to it. Then we have your flotillas, which are your temporary or small formations, again, generally run by a Commodore. Then what kind of assets do you have in a fleet? Well, you've got your capital ships. These are your massive ones, your battleships and dreadnoughts. A typical sector fleet will have usually 1 or 2 dreadnought squadrons and 4 vessels in each of those, plus supports, 3 to 4 first-class battleship squadrons, 5 to 6 second-class battleship squadrons, 2 to 4 battle rider squadrons, and 2 to 3 fleet carrier squadrons. Typically have 16 fleet cruiser squadrons available, each of nominally 4 ships and a mix of heavy and light cruisers, armored cruisers, and cruiser-sized carriers, and all are considered capable of carrying out the crew run mission. They will have some specialist vessels as well, specialist cruisers like missile cruisers and bombardment cruisers, and typical force there would be 4 to 6 heavier armored cruiser squadrons, 6 to 8 light cruiser squadrons in 2 to 4 light carrier squadrons, and 2 to 4 additional squadrons of specialist vessels. Then you got your destroyers and escorts. So a sector fleet will have roughly 24 to 30 destroyer squadrons, each nominally of 4 vessels, similar number of escort destroyer squadrons. There'll be about 200 to 220 small escorts. Then you got your support vessels, tankers, auxiliaries, salvage and repair vessels, couriers. There'll be about 600 of them. A sector admiral has an enormous number of ships at their disposal of all different shapes and sizes. And then we get into naval bases. So, their functions in local security, allowing places for resupply, so they keep stocks of consumables like rations, warheads, fuel, etc. And they'll often have a flotilla of naval auxiliaries and logistics ships as well. An often overlooked and very important function of bases is comms and intelligence. So couriers and auxiliaries and other vessels are constantly moving on, and they carry messages between the bases. And small bases might not have a dedicated courier pool, but the couriers will stop by and make sure that they have intelligence available. Those that do have dedicated couriers will have an intelligence gathering function and will try to keep up with the most current intelligence data and pass that along to the Navy. They can also perform repair and maintenance, which is important when you're dealing with huge fleets, particularly some of which will be taking damage. They also have personnel and training facilities, so when people get knocked out during a ship combat, you've got folks ready to replace them. They also are centers for planning, exercises, and preparedness, so they can do war games to prepare for major incidents. They will plan what they're going to do, where things will be deployed, and work on preparedness overall. They also do some R&D. The Navy of the Imperium is the most technologically advanced, I believe, so they're at tech level 15. The Jordani fleet is at 14, and so R&D is there to keep that advantage. And finally, the bases will keep some mothballed fleets, so it's better than disposing of them. And if in the worst case, if they're too crappy to be repaired and put back into service, they could be used as sources for spares. Then you get your naval depots. These are main regional bases of the Imperial Navy. They'll have a huge amount of ship traffic. There'll be naval vessels departing on patrol. There'll be war exercises, security patrols. There's basically a huge naval presence, so it's very difficult for enemies to embed themselves with any assets in these kind of depot areas. Major bases, which are usually on large orbital structures like near gas giants or rocky planets, but could also be built on a planetoid itself. There's often like a base region rather than just a single area. No civilian traffic will be allowed. These key bases are protected very strongly because they are major assets. They'll have static defenses as well, so typically missile launchers and some sort of local defense force of their own. They're associated mainly with the sector fleet, subsector fleet, or both. So these are really important static assets that the Navy needs to have at these different levels. So this is an interesting one. So of course the main asset of the Navy is its warships, but there are different vessel types. Got different levels of mobility as well. So system craft are those that don't have any jump capability. Your system defense vessels, your monitors, and small craft. You got your mobile assets, so they can move from one system to another, but they're only jump rated between 1 and 3. Fleet mobile is jump 4, so this is kind of the minimum standard for the Imperial Navy. And then we've got Rift mobile, so these have jump 5 to 6, and these are the ships that are capable of fast reactions, long range operations, and moving through areas of sparse stellar density, so like the Great Rift, for example. Then they give us a rundown of different types of vessels. So capital vessels are the biggest, the most prestigious, so they're designed for direct combat, crushing enemy units while shaking off everything thrown at them. So they're typically built around a spinal mount. These are huge weapons that run across the whole spine of the ship. They draw a tremendous amount of power, but deal out enormous destruction. The super dreadnought is the largest of the available capital vessels, and that's what we'll look at in the last chapter of this book, in fact. And you got the dreadnoughts, so they're the backbone of the fleet. And we got the battleships, which are downrated dreadnoughts, so dreadnoughts that are not at the cutting edge anymore, and purpose-designed second line of battleship. And they're also sub-designations of first class, second class, and third class battleships. They also have huge spinal mounts and lots of secondary bay weapons. And you got battle cruisers. They're not able to stand up really very long on their own, but instead they take fast strike operations against enemy shipping or bases or chase down enemy cruisers. So they're more about disruption, dealing with supply and logistics. Then you got battle riders. So these are an alternative to jump capable warships. So the battle rider doesn't have space for jump engines or fuel. They use that for weapons and armor, and then they'll have a tender. They're quite a bit more effective in combat than an equivalent jump force capable ship. But if the fight goes against it, they're kind of stuck. So the concept is not currently viewed very favorably in the Navy, but it's something that they can fall back on. Then you got your cruisers. They're the workhorse units. There are tons of them, and they're typically a powerful spinal mount and relatively light secondary bay weapons. We have an example here of a heavy cruiser. These are fleet assets capable of undertaking most naval operations. Armament is centered around a heavy spinal mount, and defenses are good. They protect the line of battle and undertake combat against similar enemy units. We have the light cruisers described here. So they're about 30,000 displacement tons, I should say. They're more about maneuverability and armament than survivability. So maybe not the best ones to be stationed on. The heavy cruisers, they're capable of taking on more operations we've seen, and they're more robust than a light cruiser. Frontier cruisers will have high jump. Basically, they're out there on the frontiers to react to piracy or other short-term problems. We've got strike cruisers, so they're fast and lightly defended. Typically, they'll be built around a single main weapon system. They'll have light defenses, so their use is to jump deep into enemy territory, blow up some stuff, and then come back. And missile cruisers, they're not super popular at the moment, but they have been useful from time to time. They're basically all about missile bombardment, so there's no spinal mount, but they have absolutely tons of missile tubes and a few small craft with really good sensors, so that'll enable them to get missile locks, take out as much stuff as possible. They are standoff vessels, so they'll stand in the background and launch an absolutely huge number of missile salvos and nuclear warheads at an enemy fleet, and they won't even see it coming until it's too late. Then you got your rift cruisers, so these are the jump 6 ships that can allow patrols in star-sparse areas. You got your escort cruisers. They don't have a spinal weapon either, but they have powerful secondary and tertiary weapons, and they're designed to stick close to the higher value units like battle cruisers or battleships and defend them from small threats like missiles, fighters, other light vessels like corvettes or destroyers. Then you got your recon cruisers, so they're fast and lightly armed, but they have a huge sensor suite, so they penetrate hostile space, they gather as much intelligence as they can, and then try and jump out of trouble. Then you got your carriers and tenders. We have an example here of a fleet carrier. So these are large carriers massing around 100,000 displacement tons, and they are designed to support fleet operations. They don't have a spinal mount typically, but they do have a decent secondary armament and a large number of heavy fighters, often 300 or so. So if you thought Starfleet Battles was tough with its, 24 fighters on a ship, here we're talking about several hundred on a typical carrier. So the fleet carrier is outlined here, but we also have strike carriers around 75,000 displacement tons. They have a light spinal armament, and they're agile and better defended than their fleet carriers, and they tend to work as mobile patrol bases in threatened areas. They typically carry 80 fighters. You got the escort carriers, around 30,000 displacement tons with no spinal mount, and also 80 fighters. And then you've got your tenders. So these are designed to support the operations of small craft and provide transport for them. So they can bring extra fighters to the battle. They will help protect the carrier itself as well. Then we got destroyers and escorts, basically small combatants of varying capabilities. So they don't typically carry a spinal mount, and they're not really considered major combatants. They can be between 1,000 and 5,000 displacement tons. And there's a number of different roles for them. So you got the fleet destroyer. So they're the most powerful ones, and they're capable of handling a variety of tough situations because of that. The escort destroyers, which are intended for the patrol and escort role, they're modestly capable against heavier ships, but they're not designed to attack a cruiser or anything like that. Strike destroyers, they're designed to attack larger ships, so they are heavily armed. They can overwhelm a target before resistance materializes, but if they're in a straight fight against larger ships, they're going to lose. When you got the missile destroyer, never really found a lot of favor with the Imperials. They seem to love the spinal mounts, but the missile destroyer will provide huge amounts of missile support to a small task force, since they're more likely to be encountered in colonial formations that can't afford larger missile ships. And we have here in the image a fleet escort, a specialist vessel in the large destroyer class. They're intended to accompany heavier ships, intercept light craft and missiles headed for high value units. Lightly armored and armed for taking out fighters rather than destroyers, and they're typically about 5,000 D-tons. If engaged in combat alone, they tend to fare badly. So again, they're strictly support ships. Amongst the destroyer class, the last we have is the frigate. So they're typically between 1,000 and 3,000 D-tons. They're set up for patrol and escort work. Typically have lesser jump performance. Then you got the corvettes. So these are below 1,000 D-tons, and they can be used for patrol. Some of them are armed to the teeth with missiles, and they're not used that often. Then you got your strike corvettes. So they're fast and chock full of weapons for their size, and they're designed to be a deterrent to aggression or just to harass enemy fleets. You got your close escorts. They're primarily intended for defending larger ships, and they're really not very capable on their own. Couriers. So these are specialist corvettes that are designed to keep up comms between fleets, and they're ubiquitous. You find them everywhere. As we saw before, they keep lines of communications open between bases as well and make sure that intelligence is collected. Then you got your logistics and supply vessels, and here, sort of incongruously, we have a troop transport. These are used to move ground forces between worlds, obviously, and landings are made directly onto the surface, or they send interface fighters that can travel through atmosphere to land their armed forces. So for logistics and supply, we have the fleet logistics vessels. They're lightly armed and have a number of small craft, including repair tugs. They're basically used not only for supply carriage, but also machine and electronics repairs, and they can fabricate spares on site. So really useful for a fleet to stay operational, especially over a long deployment. You got your tanker and resupply ships, so they carry loads of liquid hydrogen fuels. You've got the dromedary, so they're a accommodation tanker and supply ship. Naval transport, designed to bring supplies to fleet bases, where they're transported to armed support vessels. You got your assault transports, where they carry troops awake in their barracks, or if they're in low berths, in other words frozen, then they have facilities to revive them before they're ready to launch an attack. Your fleet auxiliary, sort of catch-all category for small vessels that carry out routine tasks like transferring personnel, non-urgent courier duty, etc. You got your reserve auxiliaries, so they're civilian vessels that are kind of impressed into naval service. And then we got a whole class of planetary attack vessels. Planetary assaults are always challenging because planets are huge. For example, here we have a bombardment cruiser, nice flying saucer type design. So it's the support vessel of choice for orbital attacks. The only vessel optimized for planetary attack. They're armed with mass drivers, which chuck rocks and other huge masses down to the surface to cause massive damage, plus missile launchers and Mason gun bays for relatively precise strikes. Then you've got a secondary armory of lasers for close-in defense if the planet sends up small fleets to defend itself. So amongst the planetary attack vessels, you've got assault tenders. So these are relatively small, non-jump capable ships that are launched from larger assault tenders. You've got marine carriers, which are crewed and commanded by naval personnel, but are typically part of a marine task force. They'll be supported by a Grav cavalry battalion, a fighter wing, assault shuttles, and all be flown by marines. You've got assault landers. They range from small shuttles carrying a squad to large vessels that can deliver a full company. And finally, you got your fire support craft. So these are in the 1,000 to 3,000 D-ton range. And they give close fire support in an assault, engage enemy aerospace craft, and large troop concentrations and ground targets. They sort of fight at the interface, not just in space. Then we got specialist vessels. These are guys that don't fit into the other categories. We got the fleet picket. They have good defenses but light armament, so they monitor a region of space with sensor sweeps ahead of an advancing enemy fleet, and they use drones, loss of detection equipment to sort of keep track of the advancement of enemy fleets. We've got the hospital ships. In case of large casualty events, a ship being blown up or large amounts of crew being taken out, then the hospital ship will come in and will be fitted only with defense turrets and sandcasters, and they're not seen as combatants, so enemies should respect that typically and will allow the hospital ships to pick up wounded and treat them. You got the intelligence ships. So these are small stealthy vessels which are packed with sensors and data processing equipment. Some operate in the open, but then you have your covert operation vessels which use stealth tech, and they're lightly armed but very fast and have very good sensors. So their ability is very useful, particularly as picket vessels, but since they do have this ability to remain undetected, they can hang about much more than just a typical picket would, so it's kind of a waste of their capabilities to have them run that role. Then finally we have our repair and recovery ships, and they'll typically accompany a task force particularly if they're doing like long-term sieges. So these are ships that will, repair and replace components and stuff, and things inevitably wear out over a lot of use. I mean, any weapon system, for example, has a huge amount of power running through it, and eventually stuff's going to break or overload or whatever. Then we have our non-star ships. So these are your non-jump capable craft. So you have riders, which we talked about before, the battle riders, and also monitors. They're built like conventional warships, but they just take out the jump drives and fuel. So they have good tactical mobility and agility. Sometimes they're built as part of a planetoid, so that can make them really resilient, but not very efficient because they're surrounded by asteroid mass. Then you've got gunboats and missile boats. So these are sub 100 D-ton crafts, in some cases between 100 and 1,000 D-tons. And they primarily use beams or missiles missiles. They're typically designed to protect a star system, and they're called system defense boats for that reason as a category. They're also designed on occasion to hide from enemy sensors in hostile environments. And then we have our fighters and utility craft. These are your small craft, typically 10, 20, or 50 D-ton craft in this range. So you got your military gig. This is just a 20-ton craft, which is streamlined, has light armament, and it's just used mainly to bring personnel to a surface or extend sensor coverage. You got the naval lifeboat, which is similar to a civilian lifeboat, but it's designed to leave a crippled vessel when it's under fire. So it'll have some hardening of systems, some electronic countermeasures and stuff like that, a little bit more survivability. Then you got the naval cutter, a 50 D-ton workhorse. It's used by large ships, bases, and starports as an inspection liaison and rescue craft, and also for cargo and passenger transport operations. You got the 50 D-ton troop shuttle for getting a force of ground troops onto a planetary surface. Then you got the large shuttles, and they're mainly used for cargo transfer to and from depots and logistics vessels. Then you got your fighters and small combat craft. There are a few different classes of light fighters in the 10 to 20 D-ton range. Basically, they act as a screen to intercept enemy strike craft or missiles. And then you got the heavy fighters, which have greater utility over fighting power, and there are different variants here. So you also have additional crew instead of just one guy. So you can have longer patrols, and you'll have more space for additional systems like acting as mid-course guidance platforms for long-range missiles, or they can be bombers having their own missiles or torpedoes. They can be electronic warfare platforms, command fighters. They can support a squadron of light fighters. I mentioned one variant called the strike fighter, which mounts a single powerful weapon, usually a plasma or fusion gun, capable of dealing heavy damage to even a large warship. And there's another specialist variant called the picket boat. It's a heavy fighter with its armament replaced by extensive sensors. So it's a nice way to fulfill the picket role of keeping track of enemy movements with heavy sensor sweeps, but they're smaller and easily held aboard any given fleet carrier. Then we've got naval operations. So they mention here something interesting that's worth bearing in mind in Charted Space, which is that the Imperium doesn't claim to rule worlds as such. They rule the space between them and defend that space between them. Within the standard terms of Imperial membership, so there's a zone of shared jurisdiction between planetary forces and naval forces, and that's between 10 planet diameters and 100 diameters out. Outside of 100 diameters, then Imperial authority is exclusive and absolute. So worlds maintain autonomy. There's an overlap where the Navy cooperates with local defense, and then beyond 100 diameters, it's all about the Navy. And they'll have system defense vessels to help out with local defense and so forth. And then we have standing operational orders for Navy ships. So in general terms, you're supposed to defend Imperial space and citizens from all threats, uphold the Imperial high law, render assistance to any vessel in distress, protect commerce and free trade, extend courtesy to member and allied worlds and vessels, and preserve the fleet in being. And during most deployments, a vessel is expected to carry out certain actions, like challenge all suspect vessels, investigate and deal with or report all hazards to navigation, and investigate and deal with all threats to the security and stability of the Imperium. 3 stages of readiness for naval deployments: stand down, readiness, and deployed. And then different kinds of patrol operations. So system patrol, multi-system sweeps, and discretionary patrols. Then we got guard ship deployment, kind of a special case of the patrol mission. So a vessel is deployed to protect a specific location and any passing traffic or to interdict a world. So it could be a powerful warship to deter or repel aggression, but minor vessels might also be used for this. Anti-piracy work is mostly conducted in a passive manner, so naval ships will patrol the spaceways and respond as needed. It's more of a deterrent than a solution, but it's often the most available option given the commitments of the Navy all over the charted space. There's not that many sort of career pirates that stick around forever, so it's enough to keep things safe enough for the Imperium and for free trade. And in some cases, the pirates do band together and form some kind of organization, and in that case, you need to have a more focused destruction of that force. And the Navy, of course, also is responsible for intelligence gathering. The Navy has an extensive intelligence arm, and they'll have their stealthy vessels they can use to do that. Lighter vessels can undertake reconnaissance on behalf of fleets, and scout ships and so forth can do reconnaissance of neighboring systems. Raids and strike operations are generally carried out by mobile vessels that have good firepower and sort of okay defenses. Raids and strikes are differentiated by the type of target. Strikes are at a specific target, which will usually be an installation or a concentration of ships. A subset of that is bombardment missions, where you're targeting planet-side installations. Raiding is more general, so that might be commerce raiding, or also known as cruiser warfare. So you deliberately destroy commercial traffic and the supporting infrastructure. Not generally enjoyed by the Navy, but these two aspects can, of course, be combined. You know, a penetrator fleet might do a bit of raiding and a bit of striking, depending on the circumstances and the local orders that they're beholden to. And then we've got a little image here of intervention. So the Navy has standing orders to assist member governments and intervene whenever it's necessary for the well-being of the Imperium. So talk a bit about that. And then we get into shipboard operations. So this is more technical detail about how branches of departments work aboard a ship. So the captain runs the ship, then you got the XO or the executive officer, and then your crew is divided into different departments. So you got your flight branch who deal with piloting, sensors, and astrogation, and you need the gunnery branch who deal with gunners, missiles, electronic warfare, sensor operation, and so forth. Then you have engineering, who deals with the drives, power systems, and heavy machinery. And the larger the ship, you'll see enormous numbers of each of these categories being needed. You've also got technical branches. So they're a subdivision of engineering, and they're responsible for computational machinery and light machinery that's not part of another department. And you have crew branches, which are non-specialists. They keep the ship running day to day, undertake damage control during combat. And line branches for officers only. You have the support branch, so these are subdivided into personnel specialists who deal with recruiting, training, pay, and welfare. Navy Education Corps, you have procurement specialists, administration specialists. And you've got the medical branch, another subdivision of support. They train medics and medical officers. You've got naval intelligence, officer heavy with many specialist branches to deal with. Then you've got the staff branch, which includes both enlisted and commissioned personnel, and they contain most non-fighting personnel, including like admin people, recruitment and training people, and pensions and general support stuff. And then we got some nice pictures of roles aboard a starship. So here we have a commanding officer, a Varger in uniform, smoking some kind of cigar. Nice sidearm there as well. Then we have an example of a flight personnel here, and some more details about different kinds of command officers, different kinds of flight officers, including, astrogators, senior bridge officers, communications officers. Engineering, you get your chief engineer, engineering officers, your chief technical officer, and regular technical officers. Amongst command, you got the XO, the logistics officer, the logistics and administrative staff, and officer cadets who are in training. Within gunnery, you have chief gunnery officers, and gunnery personnel. Look at this guy's cool outfit here. Really gotta love that. And then you have your crew roles. So operations officers, deck officers, specialist officers like medics and personnel officers. You got deck personnel. You got master at arms. So they oversee the maintenance and use of personal weaponry and protective equipment during combat. You got the chain of command, a little bit of detail about how that works, command procedures. We're getting really into the weeds here with this stuff. We've got how watches and duty watches work aboard a ship, routine security operations, and the level of security authorization in force. And we have boarding and inspections. So the Imperial Navy has the right to stop and search any ship in Imperial space. And as any long-term player of Traveller knows, they love to exercise this right. So you got to watch out for that. The Navy not only has the right, but the duty to board and search. Then you've got your higher-ranking subordinates aboard the ships, how that works in combat situations and so forth, and personal weaponry. So all Navy officers other than medical personnel have a sidearm. They're kept in quarters rather than the armory, so this is their personal sidearm. All officers will also have a dress sword for ceremonial occasions, and they have fighting swords as well for security personnel and officers. They're not as fancy as the dress sword, but they are intimidating, and they're great for boarding actions where, letting loose a bunch of bullets or plasma beams or whatever could damage a hull and punch holes in it. Then you've got ship handling, so it includes things like operating transponders and the IFF systems, identification friend or foe, moving in system. Under combat or alert conditions, vessels will travel at creep with low acceleration and consequently lower emissions, or sprint and drift using short bursts of acceleration and keep the drive section turned away from the suspected location of any hostiles. And then they'll drift, and they'll often have a quiet or silent on the transponder to make themselves relatively invisible while they're drifting, and need to hit the thrust again to make a maneuver. We got jump procedures, so 3 stages of readiness. Then we got 2 stages of initiation, then the jump is actually initiated. There's a time where you can do an emergency abort. The normal jump cycle takes 15 to 20 minutes, assuming that you have an astrogation plot ready. Sometimes you need to do a crash jump, where you can do a jump in 1 to 2 minutes if you've got a course already in the computer. It's very straining on the jump drive, though, because it has to pump in all that power at once. The fleet jump is an interesting one. So if you're a fleet, you obviously want to try and jump at the same time, but jump mechanics are not really properly understood. So even if 2 similar vessels enter jump at the same time, they can come out a couple days apart. There are 2 different ways to deal with this. So basically, the first is to just accept that things vary like that and allow time for your force to marshal itself on the other side, and you make jumps to points distant from where you think the enemy is, but it's not always practical. Sometimes you need to jump into action right away before the enemy fleet can make their move. They also have squadron jump systems for the situation, so they generate jump parameters for a group of ships rather than a single vessel, and then slave the systems of all ships to a central initiation circuit, and the technology is highly sensitive. So basically nobody outside the Navy has these. It reduces the variation in jump times to about an hour either way and minimizes the positional variance. So you can also analyze a vessel's jump parameters and try to initiate a pursuit jump to the same location. And if you do the pursuit jump very quickly after the first ship jumped, then there's a pretty good chance that you can arrive in the same relative position to those you're pursuing. But the more the delay, the more difficult it'll be to follow them. Pursuit jump is difficult and not often that useful, really. Then you've got your tactical mobility. So mobility is in terms of acceleration, so how ships can move around a system quickly. And agility is not only the thrust capability of a ship, but also its ability to reorient itself. Agility is a force multiplier for combat, because if a naval ship can reorient itself quickly, that allows it to be more responsive to threats from different directions and so forth. Then we get into the mounts, turrets, and batteries. So the primary weapon system is usually a spinal mount if it's a cruiser or larger, and bay weapons for destroyers. And in smaller ships, they might just be turrets or barbettes, barbettes are slightly larger than turrets. And you have secondary weapons, which typically be bays for larger ships, and they could be tons of them, or you could have very many missile systems, for example. And then tertiary systems are batteries of 2 to 6 turrets. Then you'll have defensive weapon systems. So these are things like sandcasters and point defense arrays, so they're trying to keep away enemy lasers with the sandcasters and shooting down incoming missiles and torpedoes. And you've got different weapon readiness states: weapon safe, weapons tight, defense free. So defense laser screens are operative. Weapons free means weapons can fire, but only under the central direction of the gunnery officer. Point defense can operate whenever it needs to. And local control, so this means all weapons are released to operate independently. So that's pretty interesting. And if your characters in a campaign are serving on a military vessel, all this stuff is really useful. There's a lot of interesting detail in here. There's also different threat levels. So threat warning green means you're basically fine. Threat warning white means a possible threat exists, but you shouldn't take on preemptive action. Threat level red means a significant threat exists, and the vessel is free to engage potential threats before they open fire. Threat level black means war is happening. So the vessel is free to seek out and engage enemy vessels at whatever opportunity they have, subject to their orders. And they also give you some times for full readiness for different types of weapons. You got rules of engagement, so when Navy vessels can fire and who they can fire upon. Action stations, what this means for crew, so non-combatants have to go to their quarters. Combatants will have to head to their duty stations. And then we got tactics within engagement. So there are a few major factors that affect the tactics in use between fleets that are clashing. So firstly, gravity. So gravity wells will confine the engagement area, including where you can jump, and will affect the movement of your fleets. So every maneuver will have consequences for where you are down the line. And so, we're dealing with a Newtonian physics situation here, where Babylon 5 rather than Star Trek. Once you hit the thrust, you maintain that thrust until something slows you down, usually a turn and burn or being forced in another direction by a massive impact. And you have alignment, the third critical factor. So you want to try and bring the ship's alignment in such a way that different batteries can be brought to bear, or you can shield the damaged section from further damage. So there are different types of engagements. So close combat, up close knife fights. Boarding is a special case of that, but happens relatively infrequently. It's often pretty costly. Then you have your standard engagements. You get to the range best suited for the ship's main weapon and try and take out the enemy. And standoff engagements are where you have missiles or long range shots and you try to sort of nibble at the enemy fleet until they're taking enough damage that they consider retreat. And weirdly, this kind of naval combat, despite this being like 5,000 years in the future in Traveller, still has a lot in common with sailing ship warfare. Generally, you have a sort of line of battle. You have capital ships at the front and heavy cruisers, and the line could in fact be composed of several squadrons. Talk a little bit about small craft and escort tactics as well. The use of lighter forces, so destroyers and below cruiser tactics. These are actually pretty powerful and damaging even to larger warships, but they're also mobile. So, the greatest influence they can have on a major fleet engagement is indirect. So they can mount like a raiding cruise behind the battle zone and sort of force a redeployment of enemy ships. They can also use their mobility for reconnaissance, and they can shore up the line of battle if really need be. Got the use of other vessels, calling up of reserves. And then we got some pretty cool little diagrams here of, fleet missile defense. So different terminology that be used, like the threat axis heading this way, missile salvo coming from the enemy. So the fleet escort, this guy will engage the salvo. Electronic countermeasures will defeat some of them. Close escort will engage the salvo, so the next line of ships here. And then anything that leaks through that will be hopefully taken out by point defense on the larger ships that are being defended. And of course they talk about the 3-axis control that you have in 3-dimensional space, pitch, roll, and yaw. The vector factor. So, you're dealing with Newtonian mechanics and you've got no friction. So, if you thrust forward once and twice and then one to the side, you'll end up on a diagonal heading a little bit further forward. And they give examples of how targets can evade a direct approach and, how you might use a fast pass to try and accelerate to the target and get quick blast at them. A maneuver to counter an evasion means that you will take a longer and slower path, bait them to kind of evade, and then try and take them up from behind. And if you match their vectors, then you can end up shooting next to each other for a long time, which can be quite damaging. And then we've got threat axis and flanks. Here we have an example of, a Batron, second Batron, and a destroyer Bron, a Desron, and a reserve Desron. Threat axis is heading that way, and we've got the enemy main force and enemy Desron. So you do need to watch your flanks in a large engagement, and with your cruiser vanguard and destroyer flank security, they give an example here. So you've got some tankers and escorts hanging out by the gas giants, Desron hanging out in a nearby planetoid field for securing the flanks, and then you've got your main force and crew Rons heading up the vanguard to check out the objective world. In this case, we've got missiles in hunt mode, so these are using low acceleration, basically loitering munitions in modern terminology. So missiles will be floating around, a final course adjustment to lock on, and then they will engage all hostiles they can. Missiles in dash mode, they head at high speed to a target area, and then they just use the remains of their fuel to try and adjust and make terminal maneuvers to hit the enemy before they get out of the way. Match vector intercept, so an example of an intercept force trying to come in on an enemy threat's flank to stop them from taking on tankers and escorts that are attempting to get away. A fast pass intercept, so they accelerate and they create an earlier engagement, but it's shorter. So hopefully, you get there before too much damage is done to the target on your side, but you're not having at too much risk of taking damage. The flip side of that is once you pass, then in this case, the tankers and escorts would be under threat with no defenses. Then we got equipment and weapons. They talk about the armor philosophy of starships. It's an extension of the hull that tries to keep the ship alive. And you also have to think about internal compartmentalization. So armor will protect the hull, but once it's breached, you have to think about, well, how can we maintain as much functionality as possible once that happens? And so that's where you need to think about, bulkheads and compartmentalizing and redundancy of structures, protecting things like power and propulsion, and they should be placed around the vessel. But you want to have your propulsion elements around the aft. That will permit the grouping of components, so you won't have too many high capacity power conduits running all the way through the ship in different areas. You got your command, control, and intelligence. So the command center is usually at a single location on an Imperial ship, traditionally the bridge, but you have manifold redundant versions of your computer core and flight electronics. They'll be dispersed throughout the hull. There'll be a central computing chamber, like the computer you might find on a Star Trek vessel, for example, but that's kind of just the center of what is a very large network throughout the ship. And then some larger vessels will also have a flight operations center, and some will have a secondary command position, which will be the Command Information Center, or CIC. And then you got your flight systems. Most large warships are built exclusively to work in space, and so if you have to perform specialist tasks on a surface, you'll need subordinate craft, and that can be either from vessels that are attached to your own or through transferring crew to smaller vessels who can then land, or then you might carry your own combat craft in hangars like heavy fighters and so forth, or assault ships. And for weapon systems, you got your spinal mounts, which are the only weapons powerful enough to reliably damage capital ships. So these are extremely powerful weapons, and there's been a number of different types that have been used over the years. Particle accelerators, they're large particle accelerators, and they fire high energy particles, which collide with the target and dump huge amounts of energy on impact. And that rapidly heats the surface of whatever is hit, and then creates high energy fragments and an explosion. It also creates a radiation flare, which the crew have to deal with. And then the Imperial Navy is particularly known for the meson guns. It's a misnomer in that they're not guns in the conventional sense, and they do not use meson. They use exotic particles and accelerate them to extreme speeds. And the point of this is that they will decay at a precise point, which is calculated to be inside the target. So they bypass the armor of the ship. They can go through solid matter for the most part. Calculating the sort of ideal decay points is a specialist branch of mathematics, which is only known by a few people on the ships. These are really deadly in the fact that they can pierce armor so readily if done correctly. and they can do a huge amount of damage to crew as well. And then you got your bay weapons, which are your typical secondary weapons. So they can have, missiles and particle accelerators most typically, and large vessels will have a lot of weapon bays, which could be organized into batteries. So for example, it's common to have missile or torpedo bays along the flanks of a ship. That means, these missiles and torpedoes can be launched without a specific alignment of that side of the ship to the target. But, a ship with a spinal meson gun might have fusion gun bays, which are short range but very powerful, and they can smash up smaller vessels that try to flank it or come by on a close pass. You got your barbettes, which are oversized turrets, which will have larger weapons than a regular turret. They can even have particle accelerators, but they don't have as much space for powerful weapons as a bay. Then you got the smaller weapons and turrets, which can be dual or triple mounts typically, and these are for close range work and dealing with fighter and small craft defense, or for deploying sandcasters in defense. Defensive systems, you've got your active hard kill systems. These are designed to destroy incoming missiles and torpedoes. And sandcasters are called passive hard kill systems to create a physical barrier to incoming laser fire, which is interesting. Soft kill systems use decoys and electronic warfare to confuse or distract guided weapons. Distraction tactics rather than straight up blowing up the incoming missile. Then they talk a little bit more about electronic warfare and then defensive measures like meson screens and the fabled black globe generator. So it's a technology developed from ancient relics, so they're not commonly available, they're not fully understood. But what they do is create a black shell that absorbs all energy striking a ship. The problem though is that the energy absorbed by it has to go somewhere. So that ship with the black globe has to have huge capacitors somewhere, which will store the incoming energy. If that capacitor is overloaded, then the energy will begin to escape, and that can result in a catastrophic explosion of the ship. The ship inside is essentially invulnerable, but also it can't see anything, can't maneuver. So what they'll often do is a flickering method. So the black globe will flicker on or off many times a second, and so it will absorb a percentage of incoming energy from weapons fire, but not all of it. But that will still allow for the ship to fire in synchrony with the flicker rate of the black globe. Then you got your sandcasters, which are used to deflect incoming lasers through a cloud of reflective particles. You got your point defense systems, which are used to defend against missiles and torpedoes. Then you've got your different kinds of weapons. So energy weapons, like could be continuous beams or pulses. Laser hits will do the same as like a particle accelerator. They heat the surface of the enemy ship, leading to damage, melting, explosions, and so forth. Then they talk about, more specific categories of energy weapons, like particle accelerators as well, plasma and fusion guns. Then we got your missiles and torpedoes, typically launched in salvos. Missiles are launched from racks. 3 missiles are in a standard rack, and then there'll be more on the other side of a bulkhead in a magazine. And they can launch a number of different ways, so through an electromagnetic catapult or a cold launch with compressed gas. And the latter is more typical because it doesn't produce much of a signature. Okay, so then once missiles are clear of the launching ship, there's a few different ways they can perform. Naval missiles will have a common bus component, which has the drives and guidance electronics and the payload. The payload will then be pushed towards the hunted target, and the terminal maneuver vehicle will make the final attack. So they have a short duration, high thrust maneuvering system, a seeker head, and the payload itself. The most common payload is a multi-mode anti-ship warhead. So it'll be a plasma warhead, which will do a hell of a lot of damage. A non-penetrating close detonation will still do a lot of damage. Nuclear warheads are not commonly used, but a modest number are typically carried. Contact detonation with a nuclear warhead can be catastrophic, but they're more commonly used for proximity attacks because they produce a huge electromagnetic pulse and a lot of radiation, which can cause electronics to fry, kill crew, and deal structural damage by induction heating. But using nukes is expensive and potentially dangerous if your forces are in close range. Some missiles will have particularly advanced capabilities like counter ECM, advanced sensors, or missile control packs to help other missiles find their target. Torpedoes are not generally loved by the Navy, but they are larger and heavier versions of missiles and usually optimized for shorter range attacks. I'm getting to projectile weapons, so these are things like mass drivers, which are useful against ground targets. They can punch through the armor of a vessel. They're much more useful for planetary bombardment because you can't aim them that precisely, but if you shoot them at a planet, you just want widespread destruction. When we get into uniforms and vac suits with loads of cool diagrams, and our first stats anywhere in the book. So we've got your duty suit, protection +4, tech level 14, and your duty suit with body protector, which is here, +8 protection, naval vac suit +12, a naval vac suit with body protector +16. And you can see he's got a big gun, just to emphasize the combat readiness here. I got our engineering suit with plus 18 protection. That's pretty damn good. So these are for damage control teams, so they need a little bit of extra boost. Then we got body armor. So this is semi-rigid back and chest clamshell body protectors and full face visor. Plus 10 body protection. Then we got personal weapons and equipment. You got your handgun Navy model, which we see right here. Damage 3D minus 3. And we got the 4mm Gauss pistol. So these use electromagnetics to fire their projectiles. And this is a standard sidearm. Then we got your snub weapons. So here we have a snub pistol and a snub submachine gun. So these have short barrels. They have relatively short ranges and they have a large caliber. So the center of recoil is low to reduce muzzle flip and the tendency to overbalance the shooter in low G. So that's useful. We got Navy snub pistols, Navy snub pistol, high explosive armor piercing ammo, heap, and Navy snub submachine gun with ball or heap ammunition. 3D minus 3 and 3D minus 1 for ball and heap respectively. But the ball weapon has the 0G trait and the heap has armor piercing 2. And when you have the submachine gun, they also get auto 3, which is useful. You got your advanced combat rifles and carbines, which are very cool looking. See these two guys here. So they have full 3D of damage, 40 in the magazine, auto 3, and a scope, which is handy because you can see a long range here. Then you've got your cutlasses for boarding actions. They are melee range, obviously, and 3D of damage. No particular traits of note. The dress sword, which does 2D of damage, not really designed for fighting, they're more for show. Then we've got high guard for the Imperial Navy, discussion of batteries, how many batteries you can have per ship tonnage, up to 32 turrets or barbettes per battery for a ship over 100,000 D-tons, so that's a hell of a lot. Crew sizes, they talk about how to work out crew sizes for command crew, flight crew, engineering crew, and gunnery crew, medical crew, and other crew. And then we talk about personnel, so there's different enlisted ranks, space hand recruit, space hand apprentice, able space hand. And here we have some lovely pictures. Again, really useful for players to kind of understand their role in the Navy as that kind of character and get a mental picture of what their character would look like. You got our petty officers, third class, second class, first class, chief petty officers, senior petty officers, and master chief petty officers. And here we have a whole lineup of them and their appropriate uniforms, sidearms, and so on. The master chief there has a cool face mask and a carbine. I love that. Then you got your junior officers, officer cadets, ensigns, sub-lieutenants, and lieutenants. And we see them here. We've got an officer cadet, an ensign with a nice carbine, a sub-lieutenant, and a lieutenant who happens to be a droid. Very cool. You got our field grade officer, lieutenant commander, commanders, and captains. The captain of a vessel, you'll be seeing a cool hat, dress sword. Commander, be leading a subsection of the crew. And then you got your flag officers, so these are indicated in Traveller by rank 6, if you get to that point in your career. You got your commodores, you got your fleet admiral, sector admiral, and grand admiral. Look at how awesome these outfits are. I particularly like the sector one. I think it looks better than the grand admiral, personally, but maybe it's just because that Aslan guy looks badass, who knows. And then they talk about the Admiralty and how they deal with the Emperor. Then you got the reserve list, ready reserve, category 1, through all the other categories, and how promotion works. Then how being commissioned works, if you want to be commissioned as an officer, and noble influences on the Navy and how they can work. So the Navy can't meet all the demands that nobles want, but when nobles enter the service, they will have certain advantages. They'll typically get a commission, they'll have relatives already in the fleet, but the noble recruit will get no special treatment officially. They're expected to lead the way for their peers, so they get pushed hard, actually. And they talk about recruitment and how recruits are kind of filtered, closely supervised, their ID is checked and made sure they're not a criminal or something like that. Got a nice picture in here of looks to be a lighter craft undergoing some maintenance. And then we get the process of basic training, advanced training, and then other routes of getting into the Navy. Life in the Navy. So typically you have a 4-year term. Early discharge can happen for various reasons. You can also resign. You can choose to leave at the end of any term as a traveler when you're generating your character. But if you intend to leave the service, they'll do a wind down process with you. Longer term service personnel will find themselves maybe doing recruitment or training duty as they get further along in their career. Of course, we have naval families. It's something we see in the modern world as well. You got your specialist service. So here we have different forms of training for specialist assignments, security, and the Naval Regiment. So these are normally serving under Army Command but are loaned to the Navy as needed. Got naval intelligence. So this is the spook arm. Get your cool stealth ships. You could be on attaché diplomatic duty. You could be in the frozen watch, which is not great because despite the advanced technologies of Traveller, being frozen in a low berth has a non-trivial possibility of killing you when they try to wake you up. You can be cross-trained for different specialist duties. You could have ceremonial duty. You could be seconded to other services, the Marine Corps, the Colonial Fleet, system squadrons, even corporations or friendly powers. So it was quite interesting. You could also be on staff duty for the personal staff of a Commodore or Admiral, which could be quite helpful in terms of, gaining notoriety and influence if you're trying to work your way up politically. And there's administrative and legal staff duties. There's the Board of Ordnance, making procurement decisions and trying to make sure the fleet has its technical edge maintained. You could be on courier duty. You could be a naval liaison with local governments or army units or imperial shore installations. You could be working in logistics, PR and recruitment, R&D, tactical studies, all kinds of stuff. Or in the general staff pool where you can act in different roles depending on situations. There's also medals and rewards, which can be gained through combat. And then you have non-combat decorations as well. You get exemplary service medals, meritorious conduct under fire, medal for conspicuous gallantry. That's a great name. The Starburst for extreme heroism. Anybody who's wounded gets a wound badge. However, accidents don't count. It has to be a wound inflicted by the enemy. Here we have nice pictures of those. Non-combat decorations, meritorious conduct under fire. You get all this different kind of stuff. Medal for conspicuous gallantry. Oh, there's your Starburst. Yeah, it does have the Imperial Navy insignia. And the wound badge, which is eligible for anybody who's wounded. And there's info about leaving the service, special discharge, medical discharge, dishonorable discharge, and then naval procedures and regulations. So terms of address, receiving orders, dealing with your standing orders and your mission orders, naval discipline. So, what happens when you do bad stuff can lead all the way to court of inquiries or even court-martial. And then we have details of specific sector fleets, which I won't go into, but they're very cool. Here we have the old Expanses fleet. So this is the sector here, divided into 16 subsectors. And they gave us examples of, in each subsector, we have Imperial Naval Base with water present, an Imperial Naval Base in an amber zone. We'll have a yellow border around it. We have Imperial Naval Bases on dry planets with the white stars. So you can see in the old Expanses, there's a lot of naval presence here, but we consider the vast distances involved, and for example, this subsector Kars has nothing in it, but it's got multiple red zone planets, so it's just something that they avoid. And they talk about the bases and installations of the old Expanses fleet, sector fleet assets, and here we have the actual flag fleet itself. So they've got 2 dreadnought squadrons, you can see here, and we've got first class Batrons ×3, second class Batron, battle riders, fleet carrier task groups ×2, heavy crewrons ×2, an armored crewron, light crewrons, missile crewrons, bombardment provisional light carrier task group, escort rons, fleet desrons, escort desrons, 40 to 60 patrol and courier flotillas. And they give you a nice legend here of what each icon represents in terms of the type of ship. So, secondary headquarters for the old Expanses fleet, which contains most of the remaining capital ship strength. So we got a dreadnought squadrons, 2 first-class Batrons, second-class Batrons, heavy crewrons, strike carriers, fleet desrons, escort desrons, 30 to 50 patrol and couriers. We've got a Kresh contingent, which is a single squadron of orbital battleships, which is kept at Kresh, along with some fleet desrons. And we've got the Pert contingent with battle riders, crewrons, light carrier groups, and so forth. The Alpha Crucius detachment, which has battle riders and fleet carriers and light carriers. And the Albach contingent, which is heavy crewrons, light crewrons, a strike carrier task group, a couple of fleet desrons, some escorts and patrols. Then we have the Sosky, or subsector fleet. So here we get a closer zoomed in look. So here we have the subsector map, as you would expect to see in the setting books for the charted space. So of course every populated sector has its code here, and then of course it indicates which systems have a Imperial Scout Base, Imperial Navy Base, Starport class and tech level. At Gas Giant we can see the Imperial World's border running through here. And so then we get a look at how a subsector fleet is divided up. So we've got a Demiola contingent, which contains a flag task force, carrier task force, response flotilla, and a single patrol flotilla. So we're dealing on a much smaller scale here. So not a huge amount on the subsector level, but it all adds up to quite a bit at the sector level. Then we get this really cool chapter about life on the Tigris class dreadnought. So it's 500,000 D-tons, and it's the latest, most advanced capital ship in the Imperial Navy. And it's so huge that, they wanted to give you an idea of what it's like to be on this kind of thing. And there's an introductory section here about how they're deployed, the construction process, The primary structural components, the command core, administrative center, flag command chambers, the meson gun, which is extremely dangerous. So everything around it has to be heavily shielded because of the radiation dangers. We got the main power generation centers. And here we see that all marked out on the diagram. And of course, huge areas of the ship are devoted to fuel because it has enormous jump drives. And yeah, you can see, I mean, it's an oddball looking ship in a way, but there's a huge amount of internal structure and a huge amount of crew as a result. So they have enormous jump drives, of course, and maneuver drives, a lot of screens to protect against enemy meson guns, radiation and so forth. Some Tigrises are allegedly equipped with black globes, but they don't really confirm that. So that's kind of up to you as the referee, whether that's true or not. Medical centers, interface support centers, flight operations centers, because there are extensive small craft aboard a Tigris. And the Tigris, of course, is built around an enormous spinal meson gun. And then they've got 430 small missile bays for secondary armament, which are just clustered in groups all around the hull. There's no central missile magazine, but munitions can be passed through the munitions handling system or reallocated elsewhere if need be. Most missiles are conventional ship killers or support payloads, and each Tigris has an unspecified non-zero number of nuclear weapons. Most are ship-to-ship weapons, but some city killers are routinely carried. Yikes. So a lot of flexibility with this ship. And here's a stat block as well. So there's only one Tigris Batron deployed in the Spinward Marchers, it says. Then we have an enormous array of stuff aboard these massive ships. So we've got 500,000 tons hull, reinforced military, bonded super dense armor with rating 17, plus radiation shielding, thrust 6 M drive, so pretty fast considering its size, jump 4, which is fuel efficient, it's got a massive amount of power, hull points 366,666, and look at the amount of crew. You got a captain, 3 pilots, 600 small craft crew, astrogator, engineers times 922, 339 maintenance, 23 medics, 509 gunners, 165 admin, 262 officers, and 65 sensor operators. We've got a main computer of 100 and a backup computer with 90. We've got the advanced sensors, military countermeasures, meson spinal mount at 66,000 tons all by itself. So huge damage there. 430 small missile bays, 22 repulsor bays, tractor beams, triple turrets with long-range beam lasers, triple turrets with sandcasters, 100 of each, 100 double turrets with high-yield fusion guns, single turrets with intense focused particle beams, 100 of those, and point defense laser batteries, type 3 times 50. And it carries 7,680 missiles and 6,000 sand canisters, 7 meson screens, 9 nuclear dampers for protection. It's got loads of armored bulkheads for the bridge, jump drive, maneuver drive, power plant, nuclear dampers, etc. We've got 50-ton docking spaces, 285 of those, and 50-ton full hangars at 15, so a total of 300 heavy fighters. You've got 20 briefing rooms, armory, launch tubes times 3, medical base times 25, 1,775 staterooms, and 3 high staterooms, and then a huge amount of advanced software, and the total cost is enormous. So what have we got? 396 billion credits. Batron of those will be 4 of those, so we're getting well into multiple trillions of costs just for ships. Forget about the personnel, the supplies needed. And here we have small deck plans for each of the many decks of the Tigris. Blueprints here with little call-outs where you see the spinal mount, energy sinks, fuel purification, energy capacitors, spinal mount shields. We'll talk about the small craft, different types of crew, the flag officers aboard, flight personnel, gunnery personnel, engineering personnel, the crew, and the overall crew numbers. So 23 command, 240 junior officers, and a total of 2,817 enlisted personnel. So the total overall is 3,080 personnel of all ranks. That's a lot of people. And there you go. That is the Imperial Navy source book for Mongoose Traveller 2nd edition. I really love this book. I think there's tons of flavor in here, as well as really nitty-gritty details of how the Navy works, what it's like to be in the Navy, the functioning of a super dreadnought, which is very cool. And I think it's a good book to have if you're using the Charted Space universe. Obviously, there are many Traveller tables that have evolved their own settings, but still, I think it's worthwhile as inspirational material if you are working on your own setting. It has lots of details about how Space Navies work. And if you're using jump drives in your setting, then you need to understand how that will work in a major conflict. Then this is the book you need to have. So anyway, I hope that was useful. I found this book really useful, I have to say. And I'm planning to run a Traveller game shortly where we'll be around the edges of the Fifth Frontier War and hopefully diving in full force. And so this book plus the Fifth Frontier War supplements are going to be a big part of that. And yeah, this is a really useful book to get if you want to know more about the Navy. It's a popular career choice for travelers because you get a lot of useful skills out of it. So it might be worth having as a referee just for that, but it also makes perfectly fine and interesting reading material just about the setting and gives you, a bit more to work with in terms of knowing about Imperial politics and how all that stuff works. So for me, it's a strong recommendation if you are a Traveller referee or if you're a player who's very into running a Navy character and want to give that a great deal of depth in your interpretation. So I hope that was useful. Look forward to more Traveller coverage in the future. I do have some more stuff that I will be buying in the months to come. I always wait until stuff comes out physical, so I don't do early PDF reviews. I prefer to, have the actual product in hand, but I will be getting stuff periodically along with my typical influx of Kickstarters and other RPG stuff, so look forward to that. In the meantime, on your way out, if you could please hit the subscribe button and the bell thingy and all that sort of stuff, then that really helps me out, and you'll know when the next videos are coming out and all that. And I hope to see your comments down below as well. If you found anything of particular interest in this book, or you have other ideas for critical Third Imperium info for prospective Traveller referees, do leave your comments and let others know, and me as well, because I'll be diving into this without a ton of experience in Navy-based games. So I've been collecting all the relevant supplements and box sets, but any hot tips are always appreciated. In the meantime, take care, be well, and I look forward to seeing you in the comments below and in the next video. So take care, and bye-bye.